Thank you for joining us today. My name is Nadia Butt, and I'm a senior consultant with Orange Grove Consulting. I'm joined by Keely Denenberg, Senior VP of Client Solutions at Orange Grove. How are you, Keely?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Great, thanks. We're here to talk about our inclusion assessment components. There are three: inclusion all employee surveys, one-on-one interviews, and today we'll be focused on the third, which is HR data. So Keely, I have a couple of questions for you just to give our audience a little bit better understanding of the HR data. What can HR data offer when it comes to our assessment analysis?
So I think that a lot of times people think that HR data is very static and it only captures a moment in time. And one of the things that we look for in HR data is kind of the progression of individuals through an organization. And so HR data helps us capture that. It's some of the things we can look for are the progression of that individual and the velocity of that progression. Because you may look at an organization and see there's a certain amount of women or, kind of people of color in management, but the data story of how they got there and how fast can tell you a lot about potential hidden bias.
Oh,
So
interesting.
that is one of the reasons why of course, you're looking at the numbers at each level, but you're also looking at progression through that data lens.
That's interesting. What forms of HR data do you typically request from organizations then?
So really as much as they have. And it is interesting because different organizations capture different things depending on their size, their tenure as an organization, things like that. So, what we will typically do is we'll take whatever data you have. Now, with that said, we do not want identifiable information. So we want names removed, we want it anonymized, but still, kind of some randomized number so that we can see that person has progressed and whatever demographic data they have. A lot of organizations are not capturing some more subtle demographic information, but typically sex is captured. Typically, of course, your age, because that's almost always required. Sometimes, racial groups or ethnicity is captured. So whatever they have, we're also looking for samples of performance evaluations and exit interviews. We love to also collect talent acquisition data. So if an organization is capturing the number of applications in the demographic groups at all stages through that talent acquisition process, that is very informative for us as well.
Yeah, that's great. Could you share an example of leveraging the HR data and kind of the analysis that was conducted by Orange Grove?
Yes, absolutely. So, I think that a lot of times bias in particular is so hard to pinpoint because we're human beings with all sorts of different identities that we're bringing to the table, personalities, right? And so when you look at an individual situation, it is very hard to say, yes, this is bias at play and here's why. So when you actually step outside and you look more from an objective, large scale perspective, that's sometimes where you can see something is happening and it's probably bias. So an example is if an organization is experiencing a high amount of turnover, and they are looking at each individual person who has left the organization, and they're thinking, well, here's this reason, here's that reason, right? When you're in it, it's very muddy. You can't really see. But then if we zoom out and we look at the demographic groups and we compare against one another to see, is turnover different in these various demographic groups? Sometimes it's very clear that, wow, women, let's say, are leaving at a much higher rate at mid-level management. And then you can zoom back in and say, let's figure out why.
Right.
And so I think that is what's helpful about the data. It gives you a way to zoom into what might be happening and identify problem areas. And then you can dive deeper to provide an analysis of why things are happening.
Right. And then you could create strategy to kind of close that gap, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Great. How does HR data complement other forms of data that is available or leveraged really to help better understand inclusion at an organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is, I'm going to use the same example that we'll use elsewhere, but it has to do with pay equity. So let's say that we've identified in the HR data that there is or there isn't a pay equity issue by gender or race ethnicity.
Mhm.
If there is an issue in the data, then you know that, okay, this is something we have to resolve. It's a clear way to kind of figure out that. Let's say there isn't an issue, but then when you combine it with the qualitative information we collect in the survey, the employees think there's a pay equity issue.
Mhm.
You are going to solve the problem differently based on what the perception versus the reality is. And so without the reality of the objective data, you aren't really sure how to solve. You don't know what your issue is. You know the kind of the title of the issue, but you don't know the specifics of it.
Right.
So that's how we pair all of that information together to not only show what problem there may be, but helps us provide a solution.
Yeah, it helps validate some of the information that you're looking at for sure. That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today and discussing HR data. All three of our components of the to better understand the inclusion assessment process. It can be available on YouTube.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for joining.